Gentleman from Arlington, Mr. Lopez.
Mr. Speaker, speaking to the Senate amendment.
Gentleman has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This is not a simple bill, and it's not many folks who've actually voted against Delegate Dickey Bell's bill regarding suspensions, because we shouldn't get involved with school board issues, have no problem with this bill. Folks will argue that this is just an innocuous bill, but it has the potential to create a number of minefields. Don't turn a blind eye to the fact that this bill creates a system where teachers are less likely to teach anything that might be considered objectionable in their lessons. Teachers are overworked. They are not going to want to do 2 entire lessons for the same class. This bill will create a dampening effect. Teachers will avoid any content that might be found objectionable. That is what we mean by a slippery slope to backdoor censorship. Do we really want to be the first state in the nation to have this kind of statewide policy? This bill is still far too broad, from art history to civics to literature. Folks get upset and say that this isn't about censorship. But then they argue that we need to put the check on the content of Nobel Prize winners like Toni Morrison's Beloved, or classic works like Nabokov or Shakespeare. Which is it? Why are we okay with protecting children from ideas in school? Government establishing laws to label literature in terms of a single factor, regardless of that factor's significance to the larger world of literary merit.
Mr. Speaker, will the gentleman yield for a question?
Or meaning is wrong.
Gentleman yield for a question.
Certainly, Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman yields.
I would ask the gentleman, because he keeps saying over and over again that it's like this bad idea that we would, quote unquote, protect kids from ideas. So I have no doubt that Beloved is a wonderful work and perhaps an important one. I guess my question is it does have some ideas in it covering things like gang rape and bestiality. Would the gentleman be fine with us teaching that in, say, a first grade class?
No. Mr. Speaker, responding to the gentleman.
Gentleman has the floor.
Mr. Speaker, that slippery slope kind of idea that somehow this is regarding first graders is really sort of offensive to teachers. Teachers are going to appropriately teach Beloved in AP English classes for 11th graders and 12th graders. And the original issue regarding Beloved was because it was brought up in an AP English class for a junior in high school. The fact is, by taking something out of context, what you're doing is bad for literature, it's bad for academia, and it's really not who we should be. And so the idea somehow that this is going to be for first graders or second graders is really absurd.
Mr. Speaker, would the gentleman yield for another question?
Would the gentleman yield for another question?
Gladly, Mr. Speaker.
So again, what the gentleman just suggested,
yields.
sorry, Mr. Speaker. So what the gentleman just suggested is he's actually fine with placing restrictions on what ideas we expose kids to based off of their age groups. Did I hear that correctly?
Mr. Speaker, responding to the question.
Gentleman has the floor.
Mr. Speaker, thank you. That is incredibly simplistic and really not appropriate to what we're actually talking about regarding the overall slippery slope to backdoor censorship. What he's suggesting is that somehow teachers are not going to know any better. And the fact is that that's just simply not what we're talking about. We're talking about civics. We're talking about taking these things out of context. And what we're talking about is when people on the other side of the or the other side of the body were actually talking about specific sections of literature, like in Beloved, which is about the horrors of slavery, and they're talking about issues of gang rape, and they're talking about really horrific things. What they're doing is they're getting into the weeds of what it was, what it meant. You're actually educating kids in as real a way as possible about what slavery was. And so when you take it out of context, and when you do that, what you're really doing is you're being offensive to literature, you're being offensive to the educational process, and you're being offensive to what our founders actually believed in. And so when you do that kind of simplistic argument, it's about the kids. And it's not about literature. You're offending every professor who ever touched your heart. You're offending every academic. they're probably aghast right now what we're doing. And so at the end of the day, Mr. Speaker, what we're talking about here is making ourselves a laughingstock again. We're talking about economic development. We're talking about what we should be doing. I really think that this is a very bad step in the wrong direction.